Um, because it's kind of hard. It's just like classifying a school as alternative. Remember how just that particular tag uh, oriented the students to not try, to not take it seriously, so forth and so on, and they saw it as a negative, and so I don't think we could carry tags and even try to make them sound nicer. It's a tag, so we just won't do tags. We know what. Right. So yeah. So we know what their technically their disposition is no different from an individual who may never have been there but still have to face the same vices in society. The point is that we're trying to assist them in dealing with the vices that they will now face in society. But those vices are the same for other individuals. Individuals will want to communicate like there's a determining difference between one who goes to college, one who doesn't, and one who has tags on his record. I would go as far as to say that there is no distinguishing difference between them if they're black. The circums be simply because they belong to the same nation group. And the group is dealt with a particular way. Remember, Malcolm said they don't deal with you based upon whether or not you're a Christian differently than if you're a Muslim. You're going to be dealt with the same way, whether you're a basketball player, an actress, or just a blue collar worker if you're black. And so I think, again, we've become somewhat confused. And so that what is most important when we start talking about the content of the program, it is to reorient them no differently than we would have to reorient one who has gone through the institution called college or high school. They're both disoriented by the same system for the same reason and will have to be reoriented by the same knowledge for the same reason. So we are in a serious situation simply because so many of our people are delusional. Because once we stop fighting, we fed into the program, we start believing it, and that's what have us in a position whereas now we have individuals who are totally disconnected from what our true state is. And it's scary. It's it's absolutely scary. I had to cry today because we just are not clear. Have you ever heard the story that I believe they say it was Imhotep, but he was shown it was a some Egyptian high priest was shown the state of where the Egyptians were going to fall to, and he broke out crying and he asked would they be saved, and the communication was that they would be, but that they were going to be far from the state and time in which he lived. And I cried because we are nowhere near as aware as we were in the 60s. And we had some serious struggles then. And we lost a lot of lives, and we were conscious to what we were dealing with. So imagine the loss of lives now when we're in the same situation as far as the same battle with the same individuals, yet we are unconscious of the fact. Imagine how many more lives we're going to lose out of this ignorance. And that's sad to me. That's very sad. We don't have the leaders. We have mouthpieces, which throws individuals off and make them comfortable because they're under the impression that we have a king. They're under the impression that we have a Malcolm X. They're under the impression that we have politicians who care, like A. Philip Randolph. Obama was not A. Philip Randolph. Umar Johnson is not Malcolm X. Al Sharpton is not Martin Luther King. And so we have individuals who have relaxed because they're under the impression that we have not fallen behind, that we still have leaders, and we do not. And so we're failing to organize ourselves and respond appropriately. And so I'm almost amiss as it relates to just where do we start? Because there's so much that needs to be done. And we're more afraid than we, and in particular, the theme was nationhood, why we can't wait. Because the supposition would be, let us accumulate an economy and establish institutions, and thereafter identify ourselves nationalistically. I think we're going to have to move forward pushing the understanding, because it's not just an idea that individuals, if they like, they can consider, or if they don't like, they don't have to consider. It's not an idea, it is a reality. It is the core of the issue. The issue is that when we were enslaved, they pulled us out of various nation states. They denationalized us, then they imprisoned us, and they refer to it as enslavement. It is not enslavement, it's imprisonment, it's colonization. And so now they suggest that they put forth some edict that released us from enslavement. Well, then, if we put it back again in its proper context, in terminology, what they're suggesting is that we no longer are a colony. Just like when Ghana came from up under Europe's rule, then they became a free nation state, and the people became or were able to assume their nationality. And so that would have to be the same situation with us. But because over here they use different terminology simply because, unlike Africa, they have no intentions of letting us go. And so they play with the terminology. We are nation states of people that have been mixed under one colony, under one major colonial rule. And so it begins, as far as liberation, with where it began with the imprisonment. And the imprisonment began with denationalizing and imprisoning. So if we want to come out of the prisons that are our minds now, and out of the prisons of various ideologies and the literal prison, then we have to assume our national state. And that in and of itself requires that we liberate our minds, because it's only a liberated mind that will conceptualize that the issue really is nationality. I think that was one of the things that Malcolm X and the Black Panther Party would have brought to the forefront in their aligning one with the other, because Malcolm was clearly dealing with nationality. And what the Black Panther Party was dealing with, and they never got to the place where we could articulate this because they were still trying to get through the ideology of foreigners. But what they were coming to was this question: did we have the right to protect ourselves? Because if we had the right to protect ourselves, what that was indicating was that it is because we are a nation within the nation that we were even having to deal with that. So instead of going to court and dealing with whether or not we were free or whether or not we were humane, or whether or not we had civil rights, or those rights protect us. It was an issue of, do we have the right to protect ourselves? Because Taney had already complained that a white man or a court had to hear. So what he was communicating was that, well, now you're the colonized, and the colonized cannot take the colonial ruling class to court. So I don't know that we had gotten there in the 60s in the Black Panther Party to understand that our argument was whether or not we had the right to protect ourselves, because if we had the right to protect ourselves, then inadvertently what was being acknowledged was not even an issue of citizenry, but it definitely was taking us out of the modality of being classified as less than human or property of the colony. And that was the issue. And they derailed that movement because I don't think theoretically we had gotten there yet. I think we were still reacting. And although it was proper and moving us in the correct direction, I think they came in and dismantled it before we had the opportunity to evolve into a focused, oriented understanding of what we were challenging. Because what we were really still challenging was the Dred Scott case that had determined that it didn't matter where we were, that it did not matter what Abraham Lincoln had communicated, that we are still, in fact, colonized, therefore property of the state that has colonized us. And so it's best that we begin to communicate in proper terminology, simply because we are put in a state of delusion by improper terminology. So it is a question of nationhood. Why? Because you can only conceptualize nationhood with a liberated mind. And what most individuals who are familiar with our history and miseducation are at least somewhat understanding on some conscious level is the fact that we have an issue of mentally being disoriented, and that whereas we may physically appear to be free, that mentally we are not. And so the question becomes, how do you become free? Because just dumping information into one's mind or brain does not free one. Information is part of it, but information in and of itself is not enough to free. An understanding of what to do with that information, an understanding of the significance of that information. So we can't even conceptualize comprehending correctly unless we understand that what we first must do is take our proper place, to put ourselves back in proper form. We are a nation within a nation that has been colonized by the very nation in which we still occupy and domicile. And that even that construct that we call a nation is fraudulent simply because we were here first. We are in a very unique situation. No one has ever been in the situation that we are in. All other colonies, it was understood that they were there first, that they were indigenous. This is a unique situation. Why? Because that too is hidden and distorted. And that's one of the reasons why they use improper terminology to communicate the reality, whereas every other colony communicated in that terminology. It was understood that they were colonizers, and they didn't try to use any other terminology to suggest otherwise. And they never communicated anything about integration and equality. They never confused the matter, only here. And so that when you delve into why, it is because they not only imprison, but they distorted the history. And they're not acknowledging that technically they cannot be a colony because technically they are not a nation state of people. They were cast out of Europe and they rebelled against Europe. Whereas when you look at other colonizers, they've always had the permission of Europe. What's unique about this particular situation here in North America is that you have a bunch of bandits that that committed treason against Europe. And so that in doing so, they maintain that position by the distortion of history, by the distortion and misappropriation of terms and status. And so that it's not an issue of, well, if we know more about our history, we would be free. Or that if we had more economics, we would be free. The issue is status. The issue is that you're constantly being referred to as something that you're not. And as long as you're referred to something as you're not, then you can't take your proper place. If you can't take your proper place, there's no how in the world are you going to operate in your proper mind? And that if you cannot even see that you're not in your proper place, how are you in your proper mind? Because to conceptualize all of it, you'd have to be able to first deal with you are not in your proper place, you are not in your proper name, and you're not being classified appropriately. You're not being dealt with appropriately. And it's beyond emotionalism like or dislike, hate or love, separation, discrimination. It's beyond that. It is an issue of who do we have the right to protect ourselves? Because if we have the right to protect ourselves, why do we have that? And that's going to begin to uncover that which has been hidden and that which has been buried. And that's what we have to deal with. It is an issue of nationhood. I would say let us focus on that. Let us study that and put that in the center of that which we uncover about our history. Put that in the center of that in which we uncover as we deal with the law, economics. And we'll have a different response. We would have never been placed under the illusion of integration if we understood that we were a nation. But the terminology that they educated us on, again, disoriented us. So they said we were slaves, and they never taught us nationalism. They never really taught us government. And we had forgotten. But when you look at other nations and how it is that in the 60s, we inspired revolution in Africa and around the world to the point that many African states supposedly became independent. How? And we are not. And let us look at the situation and study the situation to come to an understanding of how that could be. That we inspired you. Now you are liberated as a nation, but we are not. The distinguishing difference is it was never distorted that they were nations of that state. It's been distorted that we are nationals of this state. See, it was identified. Everybody knew Ghanaians were nationals of Ghana. They just were being colonized, therefore enslaved, if we want to use that term. But when you get over here, they start talking slick or out of the side of their mouth, or as the indigenous people said, with a forked tongue. And that's why they had to lie and say everybody came from Africa. Because if not, then we would have understood that we needed to be nationalized, that we needed to realize our nationality here, our connection to the land here. So you can't, how do you say to someone who owned the land that they can't stand on a corner in that land? How do you say to someone who own it that they can't have something that grows from it? It is an issue. Again, they derailed us when they got us on the issue of reparation. It's not an issue of reparation as that idea is being communicated. It is an issue of us recovering, reestablishing our nation status. And that's why